morning, everyone. My name is Jimmy Bashar with the ISO Stakeholder Engagement Group. Thank you all, of course, for joining once more the Extended Day Ahead Market Working Group number 2 related to the transmission commitment and congestion rent allocation. I'm here today with my colleagues, Debbie Levine, who is the facilitator assigned to this working group, and Emily Hughes, who is our scribe. We are also joined by Phil Pettingill as well, who is the coordinator overseeing all 3 of the currently active EDAM working groups. I'd also like to thank Kathy Anderson once more, who is here again today to continue her presentation on behalf of the EIM entities for the transmission elements of the EDAM design. The meetings for the specific working group, as you may know by now, are held weekly on Tuesdays and Thursdays from 9 to 11 a.m. Pacific, the participation details of which are available on the ISO's public calendar. The agenda for today, as you can see, after the introduction, I'll hand it over to Debbie, who will go over the draft scope topic timeline and any further clarifications, after which she'll hand it over to Kathy to continue the EIM presentation. And then Emily will provide a recap of the discussion, and then we'll hand it over back to Deb. And on the next slide, courtesy reminders that these working groups are intended to be collaborative, and we encourage participants, of course, to share ideas and perspectives throughout. If at any time you have a question, please raise your hand by using the virtual raise hand icon. And once you click it once, you will be in the queue, and then you will click it again to get out of the queue after you finish your question or comment. And for everybody, we please request that you state your name and affiliation first so that the rest of the group knows who's speaking. These working groups are also recorded, as you may know, and the video files are posted on the corresponding working group web pages. We please request that you request permission from the ISO before reprinting any related transcriptions. And as you also may know, stakeholders are always welcome to present perspectives at these meetings. To do so, please submit a request using the link located on the resources slide on this presentation. And on the next slide, you will see all of the reference links and material. And this is where you'll find all of the related meeting material to help you engage in the EDAM stakeholder process. And with that, I'll hand it over to Debbie.
Thanks so much, Jimmy. Next slide, please. One of the things that we've been trying to work on internally is to give everyone an idea of when each one of the scope items is going to be talked about. And for the lack of anything better, what I ended up doing is we had the 6 scope topics that we had all agreed to back on, oh my gosh, that was the 6th of January, so a week ago. God, it seems much longer than that. Anyways, with the 6 topics, so transmission availability, timing and duration, then transmission unavailability, compensation, congestion rent allocation, and then external resource participation. So given the time frames that we've got and the kind of the complexities associated with that, you'll see I've got a number of weeks associated with transmission availability. I think, you know, that's going to be one of our big things. And then time set aside. So hopefully this will give you an idea going forward as to when we anticipate that we'll be talking about those subjects. So if you don't care about anything except compensation, that's probably going to be early to mid-February. But please do go ahead and we'll update this on the website once we've actually completed a scope item so that we can go ahead and move forward. So please, if you're, you know, just here to hear about compensation and congestion rent allocation, please pay attention because that might be accelerated to the extent that we have the opportunity to do that. Next slide, please. Oh, one more thing. Steve Keene from the last meeting had asked a question, but we couldn't hear him. And what his question was is, will transmission KISO and EDAM impact the MIC availability for resource adequacy? And the answer to that question is no, because MIC is not a transmission right. It's only used for the resource adequacy showing, and MIC is allocated to the load serving entities. So it's not going to impact the use of transmission in the extended day ahead market. So Steve, if you're on the line, there's 104 people. But Steve, if you're on the line, that's the answer to your question. And with that, I'd like to go ahead and turn it over to Kathy Anderson. And if you could move all the way to slide 23, I believe that's where we left off. And Kathy, the floor is yours. Thanks so much.
All right, thank you. Can you confirm you can hear me?
Yes, we can.
Great, okay.
That's the same, yep.
Okay, perfect. So when we talked about all the buckets, and that just basically gives you different transmission that the market can use. And then the next question is, you know, how does the optimization, I can't talk today, of each transmission type kind of work? And the way when we thought about it, we thought, you know, well, the best is of course to use that transmission that doesn't have an additional incremental hurdle to it. So, you know, the market would want to do that, you know, bucket 1 transmission and bucket 2 transmission, and then only use that bucket 3 incremental ATC transmission to the extent that you can clear it, that you can clear the transmission charge. And so that's the way we kind of just thought about it, at least a couple of years ago when we presented this slide back then. You know, there's a way, you know, you could maybe potentially leverage existing, you know, ETSR transfer cost mechanisms, but there's definitely, you know, different ways this could be done. But that kind of just explains this slide. Next slide. When we think bucket 3 transmission, we started talking among the EIM group about, well, where do you charge that at? Do you charge it on the imports or the exports? What do you do with wheel throughs? And so we kind of came up with the thought that, you know, the hurdle rate between BAs at their ties, you would charge that hurdle rate or that additional incremental charge on the export leg from a particular BA. And the thought behind that was that the imports are generally, you know, used for load, you know, and if it's a wheel through, you're going to catch it on the backside as it's exiting anyway. And so for this case, you wouldn't get a charge on the import and a charge on the export. You would just get the incremental payment on the export because that would be usage of your system to support somebody else. And so that's kind of where we thought about, again, that would be consistent with the thought of, you know, internally selling off your system a resource. They need to go get point to point and pay a rate for it. And it also kind of is that wheel through. The export, you know, is going to another VA, therefore, you know, that would be the charge. So that was that thought. So when the question comes up of, you know, do you charge it on the import and the export, we were thinking you would just charge it on the export. Next slide. It also raises a question when you start talking timelines. And so this is not, I want to just say, this is not set in stone. This is not, you know, the only way to do it. This is just something that we were thinking of. How do you manage this process within the timelines that exist and not, you know, impact customers who want to continue to do bilateral deals or who need to continue? How do you make sure that the transmission that you're kind of letting the market have the opportunity to optimize is really there from not only the start of the time that the market is trying to run to the end of that time, so that, you know, the number doesn't change. So we were looking at how to do this, and the potential that we came up with was a potential for what we call a processing hold period that could just put on a hold kind of OAT sales of the transmission that's identified as bucket 3. So at a certain time, and in this case, you know, we're just saying like, you know, at 9:30 or something, I'm thinking that looks about like any requests that are in the queue for transmission service to that point are processed. Anything that is received between that time and 1 o'clock is kind of held in a queue status hold for the market to determine what it's going to need, and then after that it's processed. And so it's just, again, a way to ensure that there's some kind of inventory, no number that the market can use that isn't a moving target. Because the problem that comes into this, if you think about it just from a practical perspective, if at 9:30 I tell the market there's 100 megawatts on this path, and I tell them that at 9:30 because that's what the ATC is. At 9:40, someone comes in and wants to request that 100 megawatts. The market is running its optimization assuming that 100 megawatts is there. If I grant it at 9:40 to somebody else and it's no longer there, the market solution is no longer valid and isn't able to have that transmission any longer, and it just creates issues. So that's why we were thinking that, we would have to maybe propose some kind of processing hold. Doesn't mean that somebody can't come queue at 9:40. Absolutely, come queue for it. But what it's meaning is I'm going to process it based on the ATC that's available back at 1 o'clock or whatever time frame is outlined when the market is done solving. So again, it's not that you can't enter the queue, it's just that it's going to hold the processing. And then it will use the ATC at the time of the end of that hold period. This does not limit the use of previously reserved transmission. So if you go in at 8:50 and you reserve some transmission, you get to use that transmission. I'm not going to go tell the market, at least from a bucket 3 perspective, that transmission is available. So that's kind of how we were thinking about the bucket 3 and how that can still maybe work with open access. We'll just have to hold up the processing of that to ensure that the ATC bucket doesn't get oversold and overpromised. Excuse me, next slide. Okay, before we go into this part, is there any questions on those 3 slides?
If you have a question, go ahead and raise your hand. I'm not seeing any questions so far. There we go. Jeff Nelson.
Hi there, trying to get unmuted. Good morning, everyone. Thanks for the presentation. Just sort of 2 questions. I don't know if it really fits in, but I'm going to ask anyways. As concerning ISO transmission, we're still planning on charging the WAC, the Wheeling Access Charge, for exports under an EDAM. I just want to confirm that.
Yes, that's correct.
So it's a sort of almost analogous to the bucket 3. And then another thing was sort of on the timelines. I guess there's mechanics there. I think that Kathy was saying that they let the ISO know by 9 o'clock of bucket 3. And then I just wanted to see if the ISO felt that was a timeline that worked, if that gave them enough time to get the information into the optimization before it ran.
My understanding is yes, that timeline does work.
Okay, great. Thank you for both of those. Good morning.
And Jeff, the timeline, we just kind of threw out some numbers. We can certainly, look at what those actually are needed for the market run. It was just more the concept of this processing hold.
Yeah, no, it looks good to me because again, it's sort of a tension there of wanting to give the market, if someone wants to buy transmission, as much opportunity as possible, and giving the ISO enough time to get the information they need to run the market. So wherever that sweet spot is.
Right, exactly.
Okay, and we have a question from Steve Pruitt.
Good morning, Kathy. Good morning. Thank you for the presentation. Just a question on this hold period. If the bucket 1, 2 that's made available and 3 is all held during this window, what does that do to the WEC footprint for real-time acquisition of any transmission? That's just something I just thought of. I don't know if that's pertinent to this, but it just seems like that puts a big hold on the bilateral real-time market during that window.
Are you talking about if somebody has given bucket 1 or bucket 2 transmission to the market, therefore the transmission service provider can't recycle that and release it as non-firm? Is that kind of what you're thinking? And then sell it as non-firm?
Yeah, sorry, I wasn't clear. No, let's say we're in this window and an LSC needs to arrange for some real-time energy. Is there any transmission available out there in the wet?
So real-time meaning day of or day ahead? Sorry, Steve, I don't mean to be dense. I'm still trying to just understand.
It's during the time whenever it processes.
Right. So during that day ahead time frame where it's kind of just a processing hold.
Oh, you're right. It's okay. So it's for the next day, so it doesn't overlap. Okay, thank you. It's early. I need my coffee.
Yeah, no, you're good. You're good. No, I was just trying to clarify. Yeah, real time it shouldn't matter, right? Because once the market runs day ahead at 1 o'clock or whatever, right, out sales can continue. And if you're in the current day, right, then they occur as normal. So I think it would be, you know, it's not non-impactful. I mean, it's just going to be a new paradigm.
Right. Okay. Thank you very much.
Yeah. Yeah. Uh-huh.
And Partha, you had a question?
Sure. Thanks, Deb, and thanks, Kathy. This is a really great presentation. Mine was more of just a clarifying question. This is Partha Malvakar with the California ISO policy staff. So on the different buckets and transmission types, are you assuming that is this just what we were imagining is basically firm, conditional, firm, those type of transmissions, or are you also thinking that possibly CBM or TRM will be offered into these buckets in the same process and timeline?
I think it might be transmission provider dependent on what they consider potentially high quality. You know, if you've got some TRM that, you know, is not sold on a firm basis anyway, you know, maybe you're willing to put that in the market and let the market use it if your system conditions are such that it can be utilized. So I don't know that we've given, like, that's why we've kind of just left that high quality. Each provider kind of knows their system. You know, if you've got CBM, I think then, you know, could that be used? CBM, as we all know, can be used only in very limited conditions, at least by the load serving entity. But would it be okay to let the market use it if you know that it's there? So I think those are questions that might be each transmission service provider dependent. But I think what we're thinking is just that principle of firm, conditional firm, and other high quality, depending on what that's considered.
No, thanks, Kathy. That's really helpful.
All right. If you've already asked your question, if you could lower your hand, that would be great. All right. All right. We don't have any more questions, so Kathy, go ahead.
Okay. Go ahead to the next slide. So when you talk the transmission system, right, I wish it was just as simple as Idaho Power owns all of this across our BA, and that's what it is. But, you know, that's just not the case. There is transmission and balancing authority areas that have different relationships and seams without clear borders. Joint-owned facilities of transmission facilities are some of those. Generally, you'll have more than one party that owns rights and ownership in that transmission line. And there's maybe one company that is the path, what we call the path operator, basically responsible for the reliable operation. But generally, each owner has the rights to sell that transmission under their own independent oath. And that creates some complexity because that transmission service provider might be in a different balancing authority, right? That line might be somewhere else. So for instance, Idaho Power might own transmission that actually is in PacifiCorp's balancing authority. PacifiCorp doesn't have the right to use that line or those rights that I own, but it's going to flow parallel with theirs because it's the same line. In addition, you've got load serving entities that serve load in multiple BAs. That's pretty common in the West especially, and I'm sure other places, but in the West. BAs rely on, or I should probably say LSDs, rely on third-party transmission providers who may or may not be in the EIM or EDAM to deliver remote resources that they own and operate. So these pseudo-tie resources and pseudo-tie loads that are going across third-party providers, or even just dynamic or just a static scheduled load, resource that you own. You're going to use somebody else's system, and they may not be a market participant. You also have the shared ownership of generators that may reside in multiple BAs. So this especially is important if you have a pseudo-tie resource where half of the generation is considered in one BA and the other half is in another BA. And how do you do that? It's the same physical plant. So these are just some of the SEAMS issues that could come up, and ensuring that you're not double counting, ensuring the market is not taking either generation or transmission capacity that is not that it's not allowed to take is going to be an interesting issue. It's not, we deal with it today in the EIM to some extent, but I think it becomes more complex in the day ahead. You're talking greater volume. So one of the things we thought is that solutions to EDAM transmission should be developed with consideration to the limitations and opportunities related to this, just the complexity of the operation of these. And again, as you're thinking about market design, keeping SEAMS and joint owner operation issues in mind is going to be important, because again, the market can't use something that hasn't been essentially given to them, and an EDAM entity can't give something that they don't have the rights to. Okay, next slide. The other one that we had a couple years ago that we presented was just issues related to third-party customers. There's going to be a change in the timeline that's likely needed. The day-ahead plan for resource efficiency is going to need to be submitted early. We've kind of talked a little bit about that in a different work group. You're going to have to communicate how you're going to serve your load by a certain deadline and not necessarily by the current OAT tagging deadlines, which are different. The next one is, of course, in the EIM, we have these base schedules that are submitted before the market runs. That's the fixed point of settlement, but in a day ahead, the market results are now the base, which change financially. So that's just a different mindset that people have to recognize. And how does that work? We have to look at maybe consistencies between the resources that qualify as designated network resources and the resources that meet the EDAM resource efficiency test, and ensure that, if it qualifies under the transmission provider's tariff as a designated network resource and meets and checks all those boxes, it also should be able to qualify for the resource efficiency test, and not excluding those for some reason. Third-party transmission customers must be permitted to self-schedule their loads and resources. Basically, they need to be able to maintain their existing transmission reservation priorities that they have today and those rights. And then, of course, we'll need to identify the new settlement charges and make sure that the allocations that are occurring are all just and reasonable allocations. So I don't think these are any shockers. These are just points that a couple years ago we wanted to make sure, as the conversations went on, people kept in mind. Next slide. Is there a next slide? Oh, yeah, and this was just a slide that kind of pointed to some of the different resources that were out there at the time. Or maybe this isn't my slide. I'm like, wait, this isn't even my slide. Back up.
Yeah.
I was like, wait, I didn't know this slide. No, okay, so that's the end of my slide. So I guess I will ask if there's any questions on that. Any of that?
Okay.
Remember, ladies and gentlemen, if you are dialed in via regular phone, you can press #2 to enter the question queue.
Yes, and we have a question from Shirley Eschbach.
Yes, this is Shirley. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Okay, I'm Shirley Eschwach from Tacoma Power, and I have a question, Kathy, perhaps for you, perhaps for somebody from the CAISO, but I was wondering, after the CAISO as the market operator for EDAM does its day-ahead market run, how is the CAISO as the market operator going to communicate back to the individual TSPs whether, and if so, how they have actually used the donated transmission in their co-optimization run? I have listened to our discussions up to this point, and I'm not an engineer. I don't understand a lot about the co-optimization process, so I'm trying to correlate how the OAT transmission rights that are donated and made available to the CAISO, how the CAISO communicates back then, how they've utilized those specific rights.
So the information from the results of the day-ahead market are posted at about 1 o'clock every day, so that you know what, how much generation, what your imports are, what your exports are, what load is served, and the transmission that is then left unavailable. I don't know if George is on the line, if he wants to expand on that response.
And actually, I'm interested specifically in the transmission rights that were donated under the OAT tariff, and how the transmission service provider is going to know how those specific rights were utilized by the CAISO as the market operator.
Good morning. This is George Angelidis from the ISO. So what we have said before in these calls is that the rights that will be released will be captured in the registration of transfer constructs between BAAs, and then the scheduling limit on those transfers will be communicated to the market operator from the appropriate entity, which will indicate how much of the transmission capability or transmission capacity along those transfers is released to EDAM. And then how much is used, it's going to be the result of the market that will publish schedules, and there are schedules for those transfers. So you could have a 100 megawatt transfer defined between two BAAs, and let's say all of it is released for 100 megawatts in EDAM, and they had scheduled from IFM, it comes back as 80 megawatts, then you know that 80 megawatts out of the 100 that was released is used in IFM. And we'll have to at some point discuss what happens with the other 20 in RAC. But that's the idea. Does this provide some clarity to your question?
Some, yes, that's helpful. The outstanding issue in my mind, and I apologize, I just don't have a good enough handle on all of this, is how the transmission service provider that knows which of its rights that it has sold as firm had been given to the CAISO, which specific rights were utilized, as opposed to the aggregated rights that you referred to, George. So I understand maybe isn't addressed yet, but I was just curious what the current thinking was.
Yeah. So let's say that you can have very specific transfers that we define for specific transmission providers, and then you know your transfers, so you know how much they're used. If they're rolled up into some more aggregate transfers, then in the registration of the transfer, we'll also capture the ownership and the parties, so that you will know your percentage ownership, and then you will figure out from the result of the schedule on the transfer how much of your right is used. So there are these two alternatives.
Yeah, I think George, I think I get what Shirley's talking about. So just the mechanics of it are going to be important, because we're going to have to, as transmission service providers, quickly identify at the end of the market runs what is the available ATC that can now go back to transmission sales under our OAT, what does it look like from a non-firm perspective as well? So how much of that bucket 1, bucket 2 did the market utilize, and at which ones it utilized, so we know how much can be reposted. There's just some complexities, I think, that maybe, and maybe surely I'm off base, but that we'll have to really be thoughtful of how that automatically is able to be distinguished and sent back to transmission service providers.
Okay, I see. But this is just coming down to designing a proper report from the market software that we could, design it to provide all the information the transmission customers and transmission providers need out of the results of the market. So it's not really very complicated. We can design a report that will give you exactly the information you need.
Yeah. I think, Shirley, was that kind of where you were getting?
Yes. Yes. Thank you. Appreciate it.
You're welcome.
And next we have Emanuel Sanchez.
Yeah, just to kind of tie on to that, seems to me like right now, if we have a transmission arrangement set up that our transmission service coordinators say it involves multiple entities, that we have to go through an approval process to make sure that that path really is available and that everybody along that path to the load sync has approved the transaction. It seems to me like wouldn't that be something similar for say some of our bucket 1, and then relies on, in order for you to utilize it, it relies on a secondary EDAM participant to get it all the way to California. Wouldn't we want to have something like that in place that's, basically similar to what we do today to make sure that, it's available for us, but the path isn't complete all the way into California because one of the other EIM or EDAM entities thought they had it, but now they can't. That kind of thing. Is that kind of in the thought process here? Or if that makes any sense?
George, do you want to try that one?
Yes, I'm not sure exactly I understand what the question is. I don't know. I think I heard that a transfer is potentially sometimes is made available by 2 parts, one on either side, of the transfer for the 2 BAAs that are linked with the transfer.
Right.
And perhaps was the question, what happens if the transmission is available on one side, but not all of it on the other side? Was that the question?
Well, yeah, if one of the entities has an issue, they thought they could bid their bucket 1, but now it's not there. But my bucket 1 is available, and you need that whole transmission path to get into Cal ISO.
I see.
Right now, if I get an entity that wants to sell power across my system, and they need us and they need APS to get to, say, Willow Beach and to finish their sale, there's a process in place that we have to approve it, and then it goes to APS, and they would approve the tag and then that kind of thing. So is that being envisioned as part of this EDAM process, that tag that gets created basically that has our bucket 1 transmission on there, we'll approve it, then it can go to the next one, they'll approve it. Now you really know you've got that path set up so that when you generate this report you're talking about, it's based on, we already know because we approved it, and it just reflects on that report, and we can just double check and make sure that you guys are reporting what we already agreed to.
Yeah. Okay. So we have something like that going on for EIM, right? The concept of the transfer is not 2 pieces, one emanating from one BAA, the other from the other BAA, and then meet somewhere in the middle. The transfer is really one construct that joins the 2 BAAs, and it assumes that the transmission is available throughout the path from one BAA to the other. In EIM, we have one of the two EIM entities on the sides of the transfer having the responsibility for submitting the scheduling limit and updating it even in real time if there is any changes due to outages or whatnot. And we register that entity in the master file that comes along with the registration of the transfer. So we assume that there is coordination between the entities, that they have a transfer between them, and that the entity that is designated to provide the information for the scheduling limit of the transfer has a direct communication to a real-time market, and something similar can happen here for EDAM. We need this information by 10 a.m. so that we can run the market. So the transmission has to be available throughout this path from one BA to the other. So if there is an issue on one side, then the whole transfer is not available. The scheduling limit will be 0 or reduced because of that outage. So that is how we handle it in EIM. I don't see any way to do it any different here in EDAM. And of course, as I mentioned earlier, we can design reports that will report exactly the amount of the transfer that was available for EDAM to use and how much was used, which will be indicated by the transfer schedule. And if we have multiple ownerships on that, we will also, we can also break it down by owner so that you have all the information you need. Would that answer your question?
I think, yeah, the reporting part I get. It's just I'm worried about the process part. Seems to me like in order for P&M to commit some of our bucket 1, that the path all the way to the sink needs to be verified, so that when we do change our ATC, that it's based on transactions that were verified by all parties, so that you can say, yeah, this is part of our bucket 1, and say we had 100 megawatts pass bucket 1, and 80 of it's going to be set aside for this EDAM, and everybody, it's all the way to the sink, and it's fine. So then we'll put that other 20 into our ATC, and maybe people can utilize it for non-firm transmission. But that's what I'm just trying to figure out in my head is how can we do, what's the process that is envisioned to make all that work so that your reports make sense and tie to what we've actually approved.
Right. Okay. So for this specific example, where you have transmission capacity and you have the ability and contract to use some of it as a bucket 1, so that it can be used in the resource efficiency evaluation between the two BAs that have this contract, and some of it as, let's say, bucket 2. You will let us know when we onboard you in EDAM to set up in our master file information about those two transfers. One will be a bucket 1 transfer, the other will be a bucket 2 transfer. We set up the capacity in the master file as a placeholder, and then you have the ability before we run EDAM, before 10 a.m. to let us know how much of the capacity is going to be used under bucket 1 by setting the scheduling limit for that, and how much under bucket 2, setting the scheduling limit for that. Because bucket 1 is used in the resource efficiency evaluation, we don't have here a situation, we cannot support a situation that you can say, well, use as much as you want from bucket 1, and then I want to use the rest for bucket 2. You have to let us know, because for the use of bucket 1, we need to know exactly how much is released for the RSC to be performed, and that part we need to know also ahead of any advisory RSC if we want it to be reflected in that advisory RSC. So it has a little bit more stringent timing requirements that we need to work out here, actually in the work group 1. But for bucket 2, as long as you let us know before we run the market top 10 how much is available for bucket 2, then we'll use it. It's just a matter of communicating information. Logistics will work out a little bit more when we get into, implementation details. I don't think we should, spend too much time here, as long as, we stay on a high level, that it's information that will be submitted by the EDAM entities to the market operator to use. We'll find the best way to do it.
Okay, that's fine. That works for me.
Okay, we have a question from Stuart Kelly.
Thanks, David. Stuart Kelly, LA. George, can you just walk through what would be needed from a real-time perspective in those submittals? Obviously, there's a baseline established in the day-ahead process. I'm assuming we're still submitting, interchange schedules in real-time EIM, and we have to make sure that whatever would come out of day-ahead reconciles to the real-time submittals. But can you confirm that we're still making those interchange-based schedule submittals in EIM, or how do you envisage that working?
Good question, Stuart. I don't know if we are ready to discuss the rollout of day-ahead schedules to EIM, but since you brought it up, I will just very briefly say that for an EDAM BAA, the day-ahead schedules out of the IFM will automatically roll as base schedules in EIM, so you won't have to submit base schedules because we know them. And of course, if something changes, like an outage, or you want to participate in the real-time market in EIM to change the schedule with the bid, you can submit bids, you can submit the outages. Now, any change from the day-ahead schedule will be an imbalance settled in EIM. So unlike EIM entities that are not part of EDAM, that they can submit base schedules and have imbalance only counted or measured with respect to those base schedules, for EDAM entities, the base schedules are already defined when we go to EIM, are already defined by the IFM schedule, and they don't need to be resubmitted. We know them. You have imbalance with respect to those. So does this answer your question?
That helps. It helps a lot, George, and I appreciate that we're not ready to dive into any detail. If you did have anything just around that thinking that would help me get my head around that concept, I'd hugely appreciate it, because I'm trying to think of the internal paths that normally is in that network bucket and how all that would work. I would appreciate it, but thanks for the response.
And while we're at it, Stuart, because I anticipate that question next, what happens with all these bucket 1, 2, 3 transfers as they're scheduled by the day-ahead market? Well, essentially, they will roll as something equivalent to base transfers in EIM. So we're not going to re-optimize them. They're already settled. We stick with them. Of course, there could be dynamic transfers in EIM that even go in the opposite direction, so that these are all optimized, but those day-ahead transfers, we'll keep them fixed in EIM.
All right. Okay. That's exactly where I was going. Thank you.
Okay. Thanks.
Okay, great. Next question is from Doug Bogdan.
Hi, Doug Bogdan for the Bay Area Municipal Transmission Group. I had a question going back to the two comments before about the sort of bucket 1 versus bucket 2, or the transmission that could be considered either bucket 1 or bucket 2. And I'm just thinking about what happens today? Like, what's the timing for when the transmission providers are making that determination that they no longer need the sort of the niche transmission to serve, that would be what we're calling here bucket 1, that they no longer need it, and they actually release it to what would be the equivalent of this bucket 2. And the reason I'm asking the question, and it seems like it gets to this sort of the timing and durability question for EDAM.
If we go back to slides. Michelle, could we back up 3 slides? There we go. So the thought was, and Kathy, correct me if I'm wrong, but the thought was that the results, in essence, are posted for EDAM by 1 o'clock. You get the report as to what transmission was used, what transmission was not used, and then the OAT sales would start again after 1 o'clock. So you'd be able to go ahead and, if you are the transmission provider and it's your transmission, then you know that that's available for additional OAT sales. If you're the transmission customer and you have the ability to resell your transmission and it's not used, then it's the same timeline that you'd be able to do that. And then typically for the day-ahead market today, tags are put in between 3 and 4 o'clock in the afternoon for the subsequent day, so that everything is tagged and everything is checked. As Manuel was discussing earlier, the EDAM will still require tags for the transactions that take place in EDAM. Does that help?
Well, yes, but only partway there. So are you saying that like the transmission providers today, I mean, this is the way Kathy described it, is trying to align with the sort of the OAT process. So does that mean that in the OAT process today, the transmission provider is basically saying, you know, at some point during the day, and it sounds like it's, you know, in the middle of the late morning or early afternoon time frame, they're making assessment of what transmission they need to serve their native load, and then they say, okay, this is what I need. I'm going to release everything else, the remaining transmission, and people can procure it if they want for like point-to-point transactions. Or are they actually saying, well, I don't know exactly what transmission I'm going to need. I think I'm going to use, you know, this transmission from these particular sources to these sinks, but I, you know, set aside some just in case, because I don't know what's going to transpire before I get to the day of.
So this is Kathy. Let me maybe see if I can understand a little bit. So one of the things that I should probably start out with is that when a customer has network transmission on the system, that's always theirs to use unless they undesignate the resource and then release that transmission back. So that firm transmission is never, quote unquote, purposely taken for them in the day ahead and given to someone else on a firm basis. That's not how, at least how Idaho Power, that's not how we do it. So they've got that to serve their load. They've got that to redispatch and serve their load however they want, unless they're going to make a sale from a resource, and then they need to undesignate and release that transmission. Where the transmission that we're talking about that gets quote unquote posted back, it gets posted back on a non-firm basis. So if the transmission provider, like if they're across a constrained path, and for Idaho Power, if they haven't tagged that and given us notice, hey, I'm going to use this resource to serve my load, and here's my E-tag, then my system will assume that they still have the right to do that, but there's a chance they're not going to use it, so I'm going to go ahead and sell it non-firm. And that's how the recycling, quote unquote, of that transmission occurs. It comes into the non-firm world. It doesn't go back into the firm world unless they purposely undesignate and give it back. So
that's helpful. So
that.
So I guess what that strikes me then is why wouldn't that sort of all of that transmission just be considered bucket one that's going to get optimized in the EDAM, unless someone had, well, I don't even know. I mean, if someone procured it as non-firm, why wouldn't you still use the EDAM to optimize it? Because that's going to be more efficient than any kind of bilateral point-to-point process, right? It just seems like the discussion about something was bucket one, but you know, for this day, I'm going to only use some of it for bucket one, and I'm going to call some of it bucket two. I'm finding that confusing because it seems like it
bucket
should be bucket 1.
Yeah,
right?
bucket 2 is really that. So, for instance, Idaho Power Merchant may have transmission that is on Pacific Corp's system that has absolutely nothing to do with resource sufficiency or serving load. It's speculative transmission that they use to make, marketing deals as resources become available. That would be bucket 2 transmission. It has nothing to do with load service or network transmission. It's point-to-point transmission they have purchased on someone else's system that they can utilize any way they want. And so that's kind of the bucket 2 transmission. Now, Idaho Power load serving folks, may have some point-to-point on Pacific Corp system that is tied from a resource that they have procured to serve load, and there may be point-to-point transmission that goes with that, and then there's network transmission on Idaho Power system. The thought is that if they're using that for their resource sufficiency showing, that transmission from the generator to the load is all going to be bucket 1. So it really comes down to who is the owner of that transmission and what's the kind of the purpose for it. The only, that's really all it is. The bucket 1 is, anything that's used for resource sufficiency purposes and showing that you have resources to serve your load, and the transmission that goes with it should be put into the market and optimized. Unless there's some reason it can't be. We do have third-party agreements with generators that don't allow some of that. So those kind of things. But for the most part, that should be bucket 1. And when that's given to the market, right, then that does potentially impact the non-firm market later in the day of transmission. And I think that's just the technical question we'll have to deal with. How do we deal with all of those? But I think, hopefully that clarification between bucket 1 and bucket 2 didn't confuse you more.
Yeah, no, that helps. Thank you very much.
And do we have any more questions at this point?
I do not see. Oh, there's one additional person just popped their hand up.
Yep. Go ahead.
I have 2 questions. One question is about bucket 2. It looks to me bucket 2 is kind of a converted rights, like somebody who has existing transmission rights or transmission ownership rights. They want to give it to the ISO as kind of option CRR, so they can get a congestion rent. That's my understanding what kind of bucket 2 is. But the congestion rent only occurs when there is a congestion, so there is no guarantee for the transmission provider or transmission right holder to recoup the cost of transmission. That's my first question. I wonder, whether I misunderstand that. For bucket 3, so it sounds like I understand that you can pay the transmission provider their rate, but who do you charge this to? If it's a radio system, you can charge it to exporter. But if it's not a radio system, how do you determine who should get charged by how much? These are the 2 questions.
So I'll take your first question, and that you are correct in that the bucket 2 transmission may not get any congestion rent revenue if there's no congestion. So that is absolutely correct. And the second question, I may let someone else take the first swing at.
Hello, this is George Angelis. Maybe I can answer the second question on how the transfer revenue is collected. So the current idea about that, and we haven't discussed it in detail in this group yet, if it's in the scope, it has to do with the transfer revenue collection and allocation. But because when a transfer has either congestion, which is something that could happen to bucket 1 and bucket 2. By the way, those 2 buckets are indistinguishable in the market. There's a difference when we use bucket 1 in RSC, and that's what makes it different. But after the RSC, bucket 1, bucket 2, it's really the same kind of transmission for the market to optimize, so there's no difference. So those two could get congestion. They could hit their scheduling limit, and that will potentially lead to a price differential on the LMPs across the transfer between the BAAs that the transfer joins them. And a similar thing can happen if you have a bucket 3 transmission, but now if that bucket 3 transmission will have a usage rate, then the moment it's used, it doesn't have to hit the scheduling limit, but even if you have 1 megawatt of use, that will lead to a price differential between the LMPs of the BAAs that are joined by that transmission. Now, the significance of that price difference is that when you do the energy settlement for the day-ahead schedules of resources in the EDAM market footprint, that price difference leads to a collection of transfer revenue, which is not different than the collection of congestion revenue that you have because of the energy settlement across locations in the market footprint, that they have different LMPs because of congestion. And we can track and calculate how much is the specific transfer revenue for every specific transfer. And then the question will come to, now we have the revenue calculated, where is it going? And that will be part of our discussion in this group on the transfer revenue allocation. I don't want to preempt this discussion. So I hope this provides a little bit of clarity on your question, Tom.
Yeah, George, thank you very much. That's what I thought as well. It sounds like you would collect the bucket 3 transmission revenue from the LNPs. Is that right?
That's right.
Okay. Now, as you know that if this is not a radio line, it could affect a whole bunch of nodes, not limited to what you think the people who should be responsible for paying for it. It could affect every LNP in the whole system. Do you intend to limit it, or you intend just, get everybody to pay for it?
Let's say that the cost for using this transfer is really embedded in the LMPs all over the market footprint. Mm-hmm. And this is a similar concept to congestion, right? If you have a congested transmission line, theoretically, that cost for congestion, you can see it reflected in all the LMPs in the grid. Of course, for practical purposes, some LMPs at locations that are remote, they have a very small shift factor. They don't even show any appreciable amount of the cost of congestion. But for the transfers, it's similar, right? If you have a transfer that has a cost to use it, then obviously that will be reflected in the LMPs over the entire system, and that's how you will collect the transfer revenue, because this is also there's a new element here that we haven't discussed in EDAM, which is the settlement of the transfer. So in EIM, we don't settle dynamic transfers, but now that we need to have a mechanism for transfer revenue collection and allocation, obviously in EDAM we need to settle the transfers. And we think of doing that the same way like we settle the base transfer deviations in EIM. So basically, you settle the transfer on each side as an import in one BAA at the LMP of that BAA, and as an export from the other BAA at the LMP of that BAA. And this is how the transfer revenue is collected, because of the flow times that price differential from each side, and that's how we can also track it and calculate it. So that will give us a transfer revenue, and yes, it is reflected in the LMPs, and it's going to be collected from there too.
That's very good, George. I wonder if you would consider allowing people to bid their transmission rate in bucket 2, so that they can get their transmission revenue recouped regardless of congestion. So it's like bucket 2 and bucket 3 are similar. Maybe they came from different sources, but it will be treated similarly. there's going to be a transmission rate or a bid, or depending on how you call it. Basically, you co-optimize that, and that would affect the LMP. Basically, the transmission revenue will be collected through the LMPs, not only for bucket 3, but also for bucket 2. Bucket 3 and bucket 2 are similar, it's just whether it's from transmission right holder or from the transmission owner.
Pong, I kind of explored that when I asked that question to Kathy in the previous call. And the answer is that right now we're not contemplating having a rate for bucket 2. Bucket 2, the cost is recovered through existing OAT mechanisms like access fee and things like that. This question may surface again when we discuss later on external resource participation, because I think it squarely interacts with that. But for now, the proposal that we're discussing here doesn't have a rate for bucket 2.
I see. But bucket 2, I would just think that if you provide that mechanism properly, you get more transmission. People are more willing to provide it to you if they know they can get costs recovered. Otherwise, they may want to hold it off and sell it through the bilateral market, because that's there's certainty that they can get that revenue.
Yeah, I understand. There are pros and cons, and we say here that the transmission that is donated in the market, it has the counterbalance effect that you will get to have a revenue stream when that is congested. So there is some incentive to do that, to release it, and we want to see it all released, of course. So, but you make a point that. Thank you.
All right, thanks, George.
We'll get into that more once we get to the details. Kathleen, you had a question?
Yeah, great. Thank you so much, Kathleen Colbert from Vistra. Appreciate all the robust dialogue so far, and really like the presentation and the graphics. So I want to say thanks for that. I wanted to highlight. Well, I want to say Tong was really, that was a great conversation. And I wanted to hit on something Tong said that about we would get more benefits from this market if there were some mechanism for longer duration transmission reservations to be incentivized to be released. That's something that we've thought a little about. I'm not going to say a lot, a little about. And it's part of the reason I'm kind of starting to gel around an idea of having the T-2, maybe like a, whatever you want to call it, a post-back process, a transmission resale, secondary market. And I think the last time I brought that up, I asked to get confirmation that the EDAM entities would prefer to do something on their own or have the CAISO do it. And I recall getting feedback that the sentiment was that we should consider that being done by the CAISO. I think, Kathy, not to quote you, but I recall you mentioning that you kind of saw that relationship between the third-party customers that hold those rights and the CAISO to work out how to create a process to provide that back and get compensation for it. I do think that's in scope of EDAM, at least for us in our mind. So happy to talk more, Tong, if you want to work offline on that. I also wanted to highlight.
Kathleen, just so you know, the ISO already has a program where we have a couple of different clients that turn over transmission to us on a monthly basis. So as an example, if they know they aren't going to use, 10 megawatts, 50 megawatts of their contract right, they do turn it over to us. They get CRRs at the moment, and we could definitely look at that as a potential for expansion into EDAM if people are interested in that. We already have that functionality in place.
That sounds great, Deb. I'll shoot you an email offline to get a sense of where I could look into more background on what we're doing today. I think looking at that to try to leverage and move a process into that maybe 2 days prior so that it syncs up with this timeline makes a ton of sense. So thanks for flagging that. I think that's really encouraging. Sorry, excuse me. But another point I wanted to raise, just to highlight, there is something that's that's on this slide that is one of the sticky FERC policy questions that we think that we as a group are going to need to be really mindful of and think about it and come up with a design that mitigates to the greatest extent we can the FERC risks associated with it. And I wanted to, it's the sub-bullet number maybe 3. So there's a couple, what's important is that we need to be able to take a filing and support that we're still allowing for open access to be respected throughout the West, right? And so we identified a risk that if you lock the daily reservation window and hold it through the market run and then re-release whatever was unused, and you allow for transmission requests to be queued up on Oasis, it creates a conflict because the rules themselves generally support a first come first serve approach on these reservations when you're in the same quality. I'll use that word. So non-firm, hourly, first come first serve. If you're having queued up reservations from entities that are not allowed access to EDAM, then that can create a concern that the design and the filing doesn't support open access. So and one of the things that we keep kind of bringing up is we need to ensure that the rules allow for intertie transactions at the EDAM borders from any entity in the West is to try to mitigate that risk. So as long as we make ATC available to the market, even if it's not necessarily a transfer, but it's ATC that intertie transactions can also utilize, I think that goes a long way towards addressing that open access risk or open access concern. But I wanted to flag the sticky point, ask people to kind of think about it, and let's keep talking about it. But that's one approach we thought of to mitigate the risk, is making sure anyone can come into EDAM and try and compete for access to those transfer capability. I'm happy to answer questions. Thanks.
Okay. Steve, you had a question?
Yeah, thanks, Deb. Steve Greenlee, Brookfield. Can you hear me okay?
Yep.
Good. Yeah, not a question, just a comment. I just wanted to offer my support for Tong's view. I think it's consistent with what I said on the last call and the concerns raised. I really do think active consideration of additional compensation for bucket 2 transmission is required if you really want to create an incentive to turn that over, recognizing, I think what Kathy said in the last call, that there's a balance there because of, impact on overall market efficiency by layering in additional costs. But I really do think we need active consideration of something above and beyond the existing option payments you referred to, Deb. So just wanted to kind of offer that and hope we discuss that as we move forward to the working group activity. Thanks.
Yep, we will. Thanks. Tong, you got back in the queue?
Yeah, I was just trying to say, Debbie, you mentioned that there is a monthly mechanism for people to give their capacity in exchange for CR, but they can get money only if there's congestion. So that's different from having a bid based on the rate, so that they can always get money.
That's correct. Yeah. Yep, I agree with you. Okay. Oh, Steve's back in again.
Sorry, it reminded me that I know on the last call I had talked about, and I'm not asking for an answer now, but if we can at some point on a future call just talk about if there is kind of an estimate on bucket 2 transmission out there, and it really just kind of goes to the notion of how's this going to impact the market when you have this universe of bucket 2 transmission that potentially is coming in and out of the market on a day-to-day basis, and what that means to as I said, the overall function of the market, in particular, the impact on the CRR market. But also, Deb, it may be helpful. I don't know if, and I think I could be the existing mechanism on the option payment for offering transmission. I think, if I recall correctly, was made in the context or implemented in the context of tank. I'm curious if the ISO at some point, or if tank wants to step forward, just offers some kind of experience in that regard. I really am not that familiar. Maybe the CAISO puts this information out as far as volumes go and kind of what's been the real world experience there. So just kind of a recommendation. Thanks.
Okay, great. Kevin.
Hey, yeah, Kevin with, yeah, real quick. I mean, I want to just circle back with this issue that Steve has raised a couple times and Tom. I agree that Steve's actually your point. There's some significant, I would say, bucket two, right? Because we know that Southern Intertie or other things are held by certain entities. And so that to me is significant. I do think though that there may be, during times of significant imports and things, there probably is congestion. And so that may be sufficient, but I do think that that was an issue that was always in my mind as well, which is, what are those hours or days that, maybe there isn't sufficient incentive and we need more market liquidity. But I think that's something maybe that's even across that bridge if it comes. But these are things that have been raised, but we've never gone really below the surface on it, just because of simplicity, trying to keep this clean and neat and trying to have, a mechanism which has the least amount of, let's just say, hurdle rates and other things in the system. And seeing what we have, bucket one is going to be a significant amount of transmission, but there are BAs that would require bucket two or bucket three to have transfers because their bucket one is all resolved internally. So these are all good questions. And so I'll leave it at that. But I think they're all valid issues, but we just haven't gotten that deep.
Thanks, Kevin. Do any of the other panelists have any other comments at this point? Okay. Let's go ahead, and this is the end of the presentation that Kathy had for us. We still have about 45 minutes left. What I'd like to do, Michelle, is go ahead and share a document that I've got. So if we can go ahead and pull down the presentation, and then I'll load. Thank you. Share. Word. Share. Okay.
Yeah, Deb, just go to full screen, I think.
Yeah.
You go to the top and just, yeah.
Yep.
There you go. Perfect.
So as we've been going along, I've been making additional notes, and we'll publish these after I clean them up today so that everybody can see what the notes are. But with respect to the, hold on 2 seconds. Need to get the list back up of who anybody raises their hand. Very important thing. Okay, there we go. All right. So I've been making notes as we go along, as Kathy has been presenting the various items as far as what's more information for what's in bucket 1 and their thinking, bucket 2, bucket 3, and then I've gone ahead and that's what all the red line is. And then we had some discussion today regarding the utilization of the transmission, along with 2 additional areas I added. One was seams issues and third-party issues. And then we had some discussion regarding timing and duration. So I think that at this point, we're going to need to, okay, come on, let's go. Let's back up. At this point, because of Kathleen's presentation, which will be on Tuesday, I'll leave the definition of the buckets alone, but I think there is a consensus that, in essence, whether you call it bucket or item A, B, C, but there's 3 types of transmission that we're dealing with. Type 1 is transmission that is going to be needed for resource efficiency. Type 2 is transmission that has been sold by an OAT entity to someone else that will have the right to use it in the market. And then the third type of transmission is transmission that is voluntarily made available to EDAM by the transmission provider themselves. So I see that as the 3 different types of transmission. Does anybody disagree with that as the 3 different types of transmission that we'll need to deal with for EDAM? And I'm only going to that level. I'm not going lower than that level. Okay, no questions. Excellent. Okay. All right. Oh, Katie Wells. Okay. Katie, go ahead.
Hi, so it's Callie Wells with WPTF. I kept trying to raise my hand and I was not quick on it. Sorry, I just wanted to, at the very end you said that's as low as you're going. Do you mean in terms of just looking at the buckets of transmission between the DAs? Because I see on the external market design questions, there's something about the internal transmission and how that will be used and treated. That is
Correct.
Still on the table for discussion, right?
Exactly. So I don't want to go into firmness. I don't want to go into durability. I don't want to go into internal versus external. All of that, I think we need to allow Kathleen to give her presentation on Tuesday before we can get into those discussions. So does that make sense?
That does. I just wanted to make sure that we will still at some point in time be talking about internal transmission. So yes.
Oh yeah. Yes. Yes. I mean, predominantly for EDAM, the big issue for EDAM is more the transfers between the balancing authority areas. And then the internal transmission is pretty much still going to be run by the balancing authority entity or EDAM entity, as far as, you know, dispatching and redispatching, depending upon the transmission that is used in the day-ahead market versus what is made available into EIM. But yes, all of those discussions will follow the presentation that Kathleen is going to give.
Okay, wonderful. Yeah, because the internal transmission, at least the way I think about my mind, will definitely have an impact, or I guess this is a question, a market design question, but have an impact on the congestion rents, which we'll be talking about in the allocation portion of it.
Correct. I agree.
Okay. Thank you.
Kathleen?
Great. This is Kathleen from Vistra. I kind of had to think a clarifying question about what you meant by keeping it higher. So just want to double check and ask it a different way, if that's okay, for comprehension. When you say, do we have consensus on 3 buckets, are you thinking about it as from the perspective of, do we have consensus that there's going to be 3 market uses that would be different? Is that a way to think of it or not?
No. All I'm saying is that, do we have consensus that there's 3 types of transmission? So type 1 is transmission that is going to be used for resource efficiency. Type 2 is transmission that has already been sold to an entity by the OAT provider. And then type 3 is transmission that the OAT provider still has available to sell. Now in type 2, the provider, I'm not going to go into whether the provider can resell it or undesignate it or et cetera. I'm just trying to capture, does everybody agree that we have 3 types of transmission?
I'm looking at my notes. I think I may think of it as 4 types.
Okay, what's your 4th type?
So I think of it as rights made available to EDAM transfers, bucket 1, or whatever bucket 1. Rights made available to EDAM transfers, which I think is what we mean when we say used by for RSE. 2nd, rights not released. 3rd, rights donated or resold. And then 4th, rights not scheduled yet.
So the ISO is concentrating on EDAM. So rights not sold to EDAM is not part of EDAM.
Well, in my thinking, it is a part of EDAM. It's just, so I'm differentiating between transfers versus available transmission capacity. So versus, if you think about it as a total transmission capacity, part of that, let's say just really simply, and I'll try to put together an example that maybe focuses on this. You have 1,000 megawatts of transfer capability. Let's start kind of at the top. If 100 megawatts are not released, then there still needs to be the functionality for those transactions to be put in as non-participating equivalent resources, and then have them do that tag in advance to hold that transmission off of the TTC that's been scheduled. So it will be modeled in EDAM. It's just a different thing than the transfer. So keep going down. 1,000 reduced by 100. That's modeled differently. The rights not scheduled, let's say that's 500. So then, or let's say 400, so we go down to 500. That is modeled differently as available transfer capacity that inter-tie transactions and others can get dispatched up above, whereas the donated or resold will just go towards increasing the amount of capacity available for transfer, for the transfer limit to be, and then
you're going to a level below where I'm trying to get at. All I'm trying to get at.
So I hope that makes sense. So they're in EDAM, they're just not the transfer limit. Transfer limit would be less than or equal to what could be made available in model.
I'm not talking about transfer limit. I'm not talking about internal transmission. I'm not talking about either one of those.
Okay, I hear you, Debbie. I just tried to answer your question. So I don't think there's consensus, that's just my response to your question. I see four types. Thanks.
Okay.
Debbie, this is Kevin. With Bank. I obviously we still would agree with the characterization, and I think, and I may not fully comprehend Kathleen's question or point, but I still think it would fit under bucket 2.
I agree.
I think the 3 buckets captures the universe. However, there are maybe sub-buckets within the buckets, but that's the next level down, and I think we do need to talk about certain nuance. But I think I just generally want to express our agreement. Look, we've looked at this from a lot of angles, not every angle, and somebody may have a very different view that will have, an epiphany. And so we're not leaving that off the table, but I do, from our perspective, we've kind of looked at this a little bit and tried to keep this as clean and simple, and it's really not rigid. It's just how we are expressing categories.
Correct. Yeah, and I completely agree with you, Kevin. In essence, Kathleen's characterization of the transmission that has been sold to an entity but is not going to be used in EDAM is still a bucket 2 transmission type. But I was trying to get to, have we captured the realm of the different types of transmission that are out there? It's either needed for resource efficiency, it's already sold, or it hasn't been sold yet. And those are just the 3 that I'm trying to get the consensus on.
Yeah, and maybe with Kathleen, I see you back in, but if you know, maybe with your presentation, we'll start combing out some of these nuances. But you know, again, from our perspective, at least my perspective, I think it broadly captures it. It may not be perfect because there are going to need to be a lot of detail. This is just high level, and that's it.
I'm at the 100,000 foot level, trying to see if we have a consensus of the 3 different types of transmission. There's nuances. There's a lot of nuances in bucket 2 and a lot of nuances in bucket 3. I'm not going into cost allocation, compensation, or anything like that. I was just trying to see if after, you know, we've had 2 weeks of discussion now, do we have a consensus that there's 3 different kinds of transmission for EDAM? So with that, let's go to Connie has a question or a comment.
Yeah, I thought I was following and understanding and agreeing, and then I think you said it doesn't include any internal transmission. And
no, it does.
Did I misunderstand?
Yeah, it includes internal and transfer, internal and transfer transmission.
Okay.
But EDAM is predominantly looking at the transfer between the BAs, not as much looking at the internal transmission. But internal transmission definitely needs to be considered in the design of EDAM.
Okay, thanks.
Sure. Kathleen?
Yeah, no, thanks. And I hear everyone loud and clear. We need to kind of maybe, you know, have more conversations about this. I think what you know, and I just wanted to flag this as a higher kind of note and maybe thinking about how do we elevate this conversation even higher than 100,000 to 500,000 feet. Let's go to the moon. You know, whenever I'm in, or when we get into these dialogues, it just resonates so deeply with me that the way I think about EDAM is different than the way others think about EDAM. And I think that the crux of a lot of these sticky conversations that we're having is, well, if you have a vision of EDAM that includes treatments for every single thing we're talking about, which is my vision, I don't see it as you're in or you're out. I see it as we need to make sure that we have the right design and functionality to respect all of these different types. But I'm hearing a lot of in and out. So if on the alternative, others have made a decision, well, we're just not going to include it in the market model at all. Well, that's a very, very different fundamental design than the idea that you include it and you make sure that it's secured, if it needs to be, or available for incremental dispatches if it's available for that. And so I just wanted to kind of flag that this again sounds to me like a place where there'd be a really useful if we could have a space for what stakeholders' view of EDAM is and what EDAM does, because I think it filters into all of these discussions, but I wanted to flag that. And just say that Kevin, I agree with what Kevin said. I'm not sure that what we're saying is that different. It's just that a view that it all needs to be in the model in some way and respected, and that it may not be as, and some transmission might have been included in bucket 2 that actually I think is from a modeling perspective, probably in bucket 1. And so there's some moving pieces that when we start to get into details, I think will become more clear I just wanted to give some clarity that I think it's a higher level, moon level question that we need to talk about.
Okay. Well, we had gone ahead and last week gone through what are the fundamentals of EDAM, and that's part of what's in this scope document. So the devil is in the details, Kathleen. I completely agree with you, but I was trying to see if we're all on the same page for anything. So let's go past the bucket discussion, and then the next section that we had, ooh, my scroll is going really fast, is, let me see, it was how would unused reserve transmission automatically made available to EDAM be defined? I think that's still up for discussion. How will CAISO consider utilization of transmission internals? That's still up for discussion. The seams issues I just added. Maybe we could talk a little bit more about the timing of when the transmission is made available. So based on the slide, the discussion was that it would be made available in order to get the bids and self-schedules into the market. You need to allow yourself at least a good half hour. So it made sense when Kathy, in the schedule that was in the presentation, kind of cut off the oat sales at 9:30. We do, just so everyone knows, for outages, all outages of transmission have to be in by 9 o'clock. So that's already taken care of. And then 9:30 for the oat sales, which then allows the market to process, close at 10. Results are put out at 1. And then, as Kathy said, you could still go ahead and request transmission through OASIS, and the EDAM BAA would then start processing those requests on a first-come, first-served basis once they know how much transmission was sold or used in the extended day-ahead market, which would be after 1 o'clock. That also coincides with the timing today for putting in tags, which is typically between 3 and 4 or 5, depends on which time zone you're on. But that's pretty much the timing that is currently being thought of, and the reason behind that timeline. So with that, just regarding the timeline, does anybody have any comments, thoughts, questions on that, or concerns with that timeline? Steve, go ahead.
Yeah, thanks, Deb. Steve Greenleaf, Brookfield. And I don't have this straight in my head, but and it's probably captured somewhere, but just Kathy's discussion about, this is really unique to non-CAISO EDAM entities, but function under the OAT. It's when, a OAT customer doesn't schedule or use all its rights, and that capacity that is unused gets released as non-firm. I can't recall the timing on that in the context of the day-ahead market, or is it really a real-time issue? Anyway, just somewhere that interaction between the release as non-firm, which does get utilized and thus is going to have an impact on the market, and then if that's recalled or the outright customer comes back and, I'm assuming prior to the tagging deadline or whatever, says, okay, I am going to use it. Anyway, I just want that whole interaction between release of firm transmission, utilization is non-firm, or offering it as non-firm, and how that kind of goes back and forth. I just want to make sure it's captured somewhere.
Okay.
I hope that makes sense. But
Steve, can I ask a real quick question? So are you talking in the context of how it exists today in a pure OAT world versus in the EDAM, and what happens relative to, you know, if somebody decides they want to use their transmission at T-20 and it's been what happens with that transmission from an EDAM entity perspective that has bucket 2 that's held by a third party, or are you talking about just the timing today as it exists?
Kevin, I think, yeah, thanks. Actually, both.
Okay.
I'm not sure I have it perfectly clear in my head how it works today, but then does that carry over exactly into an EDAM world, or do you need to make adjustments? And this kind of interrelates to kind of broader issues on, and maybe it's not an EDAM issue because it's more of a real-time issue, but just when you get into how the CAISO is going to manage all this from a transmission market scheduling priority issue, this non-firm firm on the non-CAISO EDAM systems. I don't know. I'm just trying to think through it and get it straight in my head. So.
Yeah, and I again, you're identifying a good issue. It's this bucket 2, and we're going to have to deal with the issue of, you know, is there a redispatch? Is there something? But we're starting to get down to, you know, granular elements of it. But these all have to get addressed. What do you do with unscheduled bucket 2? And I think there are going to be some very strong views. And then we also heard from George on, you know, can that be set outside of the market, and apparently, at least under current thought, you know, it's going to get utilized. And then the question is, you know, what happens if there's an infeasibility or something else, which, you know, so this gets into deeper layers. And, but I do think, you know, you're flagging an issue that we have to address.
Yeah. Okay. And I think it's been potentially raised in other contexts, but I just want to make sure it's captured in Deb's write-up. So thanks.
Okay. So, Steve, are you okay? You know, I think you're looking for the timing for non-firm transmission is made available for resale.
Yes, and kind of the implications on the market, on how, you know, CAISO's, I don't know how to put it, just the impact of those non-firm schedules on kind of the market results.
Okay. Gotcha. Okay, great. Okay, Kathleen?
Great. This is Kathleen Colbert from Vistra. I just want to, so I think that there's a few things missing. Maybe at the top, I'll try and do it chronologically, if that's helpful. Okay. Is that easier for you if I do it like that?
Yeah, perfect.
Okay, cool. Okay, so I think that there is a, you know, we can talk about how often we would want to support a transmission buyback, whatever we want to call it. But you theoretically could and might align it with the annual, monthly, weekly timelines that used in the OAT reservation world, so it's a little bit more aligned with that. But you could think of, so timing for the transmission buyback, maybe we want to see if someone's willing to sell back a year, if someone wants to be open to selling back a monthly reservation, a weekly reservation. So that is an important timing question to discuss. And I'll pause, I'll let you capture it before I go to the next one. They might need to align, but yeah, just a definitely not saying have to, but there could be efficiencies if we did that.
And I understand that there's a process associated with that, and that, you know, it can be a couple of weeks before it's, depends upon whose out it is, as to whether the transfer is approved or not by the transmission provider. So that's probably going to need to be considered also.
Yeah, that's a really good point. And I think that's why I'll also cite, I think we might find that it's not possible to align it with every OAT. So like we may just need to find the best timing that works for incentivizing transmission to be sold back, right, to increase benefits. That's if that's a principle. The second item that we need to think about from a timing perspective, I'm assuming this goes all the way to the the one prior to T-2. So an entity that holds daily rights would be able to monthly, yearly, let's say others includes T-2. So now I'm in the T-2 timeframe. There's another trick point of deciding which designated network resource to undesignate leading up to the day ahead process. And just to spill a little ink on, you don't have to write this, but an option that entities could use to help inform that would be the D+2 runs. We could provide that as indicative information on what the market results could look like. I mean, we always give tons of caveats about D+2, right? But it is information. We use it today for planning purposes in the gas world. We provide it to the gas companies so that they can look forward and plan going into the day ahead, and so can gas marketers. So I think, you know, on that principle, it's something that we could provide to participants. They could see the results, and then that could inform and give them enough time to go through and undesignate. I have, you know, and I think there's some sticky questions in there, but we want to ask the EDAM entities to say what's the minimum amount of time that they would need to make that decision by, and what time do they need. So like, what's the time point that the EDAM entities would need to have completed that undesignation? I don't know what that is right now. So I would just say that's an XX to be decided, but that's an answer and feedback we need from them. Once you have that, then we're in the T-1 day ahead time frame, which is what I see kind of at this point. Now we're into the day ahead scheduling requirement. So if I back up from, and I think that needs to back farther from when are the EDAM entities calculating their available transmission capacity values that they're going to transmit to the market. I would put all of that prior to the red line above. So I don't know what these times are, and I'm not suggesting them. I'm just conceptually walking back from 9:30. If you said 9:30 is when we kind of freeze the information, so we lock it, which makes sense. We kind of do that for outages, T-30. 9:30, we lock it. Let's say the ATC is transmitted at 9 a.m. perhaps. Transfer limit, maybe that's the time point. Then I would say that the day ahead scheduling requirement for E-tags to lock in their priority treatment in EDAM, let's say it's 8 a.m. perhaps. And I'm just throwing those out conceptually just to paint a picture for everyone. So day ahead, anyone with rights can get their tags in by 8 a.m., 9 a.m. ATC is provided to the CAISO, so any unscheduled rights would be released through that ATC for use in the market. 9:30, fine. You lock in the OAT process. Just one note that I would suggest we want to be able to incentivize customers to come into EDAM to compete for that available transmission capacity contemporaneously. So we may want to think about whether or not allowing customers to come in and still queue up in Oasis kind of mutes the signal to incent them to go through the process of registering to participate in EDAM, setting up intertie capability. There's some work that all of the non-EDAM areas are going to have to do to be able to interface with EDAM. And I just want to be mindful that we set this up in a way that incentivizes them to put forward that work so that it can be as competitive as possible. And I think those are probably the biggest ones. Thanks.
Okay. Yeah. You're getting down into the extreme detail of the steps that an entity would go through, and we weren't trying to do that in these working group meetings. We're trying to keep it at a higher level. But I don't necessarily disagree with you. We could we freeze the transmission at about the 9 o'clock with the outages. If we have the schedules coming in between 9 and 10, that would then go ahead and establish for the EDAM entities who have OAT sales, they need to freeze or stop selling their transmission because it's now being put into EDAM, allow EDAM to run, and then continue with the OAT sales for whatever is not being used in EDAM. So I don't disagree with that. Let me see, Steve, you have your hand up. Oh no, Jeff Spires, sorry. Steve forgot to take his hand down.
Hi Deb, Jeff Spires with PowerX. Just a brief comment about the wording in this section related to bucket 2. I think the first statement there I think is pretty consistent with what we've been talking about, that transmission customer voluntarily makes their transmission available in return for congestion rents. But the rest of that area then goes on to say transmission would be automatically made available to the EDAM if it's not used on a day-ahead basis. And I don't think that is the consensus view, and I think it's somewhat at odds with the concept of voluntary donation. So I just wanted to flag that as, I know that's a subject that's been raised, but just the way that it's worded is sort of sounds declarative, and I think that's not probably the right way to frame that question.
Something like that, Jeff?
Yeah, I mean, I think flagging it is really what I was hoping to do. I think it's a broader conversation to have about, is the design for bucket 2 associated with a rights holder taking an action to put their rights into the market versus, I think, a different approach along the lines of either I schedule on my rights, or if I don't, they automatically get put into EDAM. And I think that has different implications for kind of what the nature of what the voluntary nature of the market is. So I think it's a discussion to be had in more detail.
Hey, Jeff, this is Kevin. I think, Deb, there was some language in our prior just kind of principles, because I agree with Jeff's characterization. I know even on the first call I was kind of going at that, but so I think we can reword this. I think we need to figure out exactly what the mechanism is and how because it's not, I agree, we've never considered the idea that it's just automatically made available. I think the question was, you know, we considered concepts of maybe OATs could be changed on a prospective basis to address, you know, the ability to release that sort of like non-firm and then redispatch. But there are other issues that need to be considered with that, such as infeasibilities. And anyway, so I think Jeff's point is well taken. I think it's easy to tweak this to just say that we need to consider how, you know, bucket 2 is to be made available to the market. So there is some language, I think, in our prior principles that is a little more aligned with where Jeff was going, I think.
Okay, great. Stuart, you had a comment or question?
Thanks, Deb. Just a quick question. I appreciate the need to keep these discussions at the 50,000 foot level. But when do we expect in the process to get to the level of detail Kathleen's pushing on? But because I think from a utility perspective, it will be important as we look at existing processes and potential changes. So the question is, when in this process do we expect to get to that level of detail?
I'm hoping that starting Tuesday, after Kathleen gives her presentation, we can start diving into the detail.
Oh, perfect. Thank you.
Steve, you had a comment?
Yeah, thanks, Deb. Steve Greenleaf Brookfield. Just I wanted to emphasize my support for Jeff's comment and just going back to your bucket. I mean, I agree there's 3 buckets, but there is unquestionably a 2A and a 2B. 2A being rights not made available, 2B rights made available. And yes, we'll get into all the details. I think from day one, everything has to be modeled. But I'll be honest, I kind of presumed that with respect to that 2A, that the CAISO would utilize, for example, its existing ETC TOR functionality, and basically for that 2A capacity, it's carved off the top. So I never thought, but the language Jeff pointed to is problematic, because I never thought about, hey, that would just be made available. But you know, maybe obviously we'll get into the mechanics, but just wanted to reiterate that whole notion of, you know, if there's bucket 2 transmission that has not been made available, there's going to be a set of protections in place to ensure that that customer can utilize it consistent with the flexibility under which it's procured that transmission, contractually, you know, procured that transmission. So I'll stop there. Thanks.
Yep, I agree with you. Yep. Doug, comment?
Yeah, it's a request. Deb, you had put a slide up before the Kathy's presentation that had an updated schedule of, you know, the topics for each meetings. Would you mind just pulling that up? It's not posted on the site.
Let me see if I can do that. Hold on.
Thanks, Doug. This is Jimmy. We'll have it posted if it's not already.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah. Do you need to see it now for a discussion item,
well,
or you just want to make sure it's posted?
I just wanted to capture it. I have a discussion this afternoon where I wanted to have the updated schedule.
Oh, okay. All right.
Hey, Deb, I can I can pull it up if you would like. I'll just take it right back for a second.
That'd be great.
Okay, excellent. Just let me know which slide.
I think it's about slide 5.
5?
Yeah.
All right, let's go there.
Ah, good guess.
That's it.
And Doug, the presentation is posted, I believe, at the moment.
Yeah, I couldn't find this slide in it, but thank you very much. I got what I needed. Appreciate it.
Okay, no problem. Okay, so now going back to me to share. Okay, then I need to get all my participants back. There we go. Okay, Stuart, did you have a question or comment?
Sorry, David, and I forgot to take my hand down. My bad.
No problem. Tom?
Yes. I think earlier we discussed whether we want to have the feature where people can bid in their transmission capacity and get paid according to their bid instead of taking the chance of getting optional CR. If it's not captured here, does that mean we're not going to discuss that any further?
No, we're going to discuss that further. It is captured up here underneath bucket 2.
Okay. Okay, if it's captured, that's okay, because I was surprised actually that there is a language there that says if you don't use it, basically you lose it, you make it available to the market. I think
right
that,
here.
yeah, and I'm glad that that's captured.
Yeah, we got it captured.
Yeah.
Okay. And actually, I just noticed the clock. We've run out of time for today. On Tuesday, Kathleen will go ahead and give her presentation, and then we'll proceed from there based on the presentation. So thank you very much, everyone, for attending, and have a great weekend, and we'll talk to you soon.